The story of Flight 401 is the story of a puzzle. A moonless night, an advanced autopilot, and an indicator light. These are the pieces of the puzzle. But there is one more piece, a hidden one, that pulls all of them together. What you're about to watch is the story of that final hidden piece. This is the story of Eastern Airlines Flight 401. It was a cold, clear evening on December 29, 1972, at New York's JFK Airport. 163 passengers boarded a brand new Eastern Airlines jumbo jet operating as Flight 401. They were bound for the much warmer climate of Miami, Florida, 3 hours away. Taking care of them were 9 cabin crew. These passengers were lucky to have made it on board, they thought. It was a hectic evening in New York, even more so than normal, and the roads on the way to the airport were so clogged with traffic that 65 passengers who were meant to be on the flight hadn't made it to the airport on time. As fate would have it, they would be the lucky ones. Up front in the cockpit were 3 flight crew. Commanding the flight was 55-year-old Captain Robert A. Loft, known to family and friends as Bob. One of the airline's most senior captains, Loft was a veteran pilot who had been with Eastern for 32 years. His career had taken place during a time of great change in the aviation industry, when aircraft were continuously getting bigger, faster, and where technological advances proceeded at a dizzying pace. The many aircraft that Loft had flown had tracked this change, from humble beginnings on the DC-3 to the Lockheed Constellation, all the way up to the 4-engine jets like the DC-8 and Boeing 720. However, as advanced as each of these aircraft were for their time, they paled in comparison to the jet he was commandeering on this night. The Lockheed L-1011 was pretty much an aircraft from science fiction. So advanced was its autopilot that it was the first wide-body aircraft that was certified to land in zero visibility conditions, entirely automatically. Its Rolls-Royce engines had 3 spools rather than the usual 2, increasing efficiency and reducing noise. For redundancy, the aircraft had 4 hydraulic systems instead of the usual 3, and it had a host of automated features which reduced the pilot's workload, making it easier to fly. It really was the pinnacle of aircraft engineering, and Captain Loft was an extraordinarily experienced pilot. He had almost 30,000 hours in the air. However, so new was the Lockheed 1011 that he had just 280 hours on it so far. Sitting to his right was the first officer, 39-year-old Albert J. Stockstill, known to family and friends as Bert. Stockstill had been with Eastern for 13 years, having started his flying career with the US Air Force. He had 5,800 hours in total, and had been a flight engineer on several aircraft, including the Boeing 727 and DC-7, before becoming a first officer on the L-1011. He had slightly more experience on this aircraft than the captain, with just over 300 hours on type. Sitting behind the 2 pilots was the flight engineer, Donald A. Repo, aged 51. He had started off at Eastern Airlines in 1947 as a mechanic, and had become a flight engineer in 1955. Repo had built up a wealth of experience in this time, with almost 16,000 hours in the air. However, just 53 of those were on the TriStar. There was one more person in the cockpit on this night. Sitting in the jump seat was 47-year-old Angelo Donadeo, a technical officer who was returning to Miami as a non-revenue passenger after an assignment in New York. Each of the flight crew was well rested and had no known medical issues. Captain Loft had taken on 38 tons of fuel for the trip to Florida, more than enough for the journey, and enough to hold for some time if he encountered any issues in Miami. Once the bags had been loaded and everyone was on board, the massive jet was sealed up and pushed back from the gate at JFK. The pilots started the plane's 3 engines and began taxiing out to the runway. It was a busy night in New York, and the flight joined a long queue of aircraft waiting for takeoff. At 20 minutes past 9, it was finally Flight 401's turn. Captain Loft lined up on the runway and then handed over control to First Officer Stockstill, who would be flying the aircraft on this night. The engines were set to take off power, and within moments, the jet was hurtling down the runway. Not long afterwards, Stockstill pulled back on his control column and lifted the giant plane into the sky. Once the aircraft was climbing, he called for the landing gear to be retracted, and the captain pulled it up into the plane's belly. It was a clear night, and as the aircraft turned south, the passengers got a view of the vast sea of orange lights that was New York, stretching out to the horizon. Once the plane was established on course, the first officer engaged the autopilot and set it to climb to the flight's cruising altitude. From here, the autopilot would take care of the flying, while the pilots monitored the aircraft systems and talked to air traffic control as they flew down the east coast. As pilot flying on this leg, First Officer Stockstill would be the one making selections on the autopilot panel and calling for changes in configuration, like the lowering of the gear and the extension of the flaps. The captain, as pilot monitoring, or pilot not flying as it was known then, would be handling the radios and monitoring the first officer's flying. This splitting of duties ensures that one pilot always has their full attention on flying the plane, while the other has enough free attention to deal with other issues. With the flight now well on its way, the cabin crew began going down the aisles serving the passengers meals and drinks. It was a clear, moonless night, and there wasn't much to see outside. In the passenger cabin, as in the cockpit, the flight was uneventful, save for the fact that one passenger proposed to his girlfriend, and she accepted. At 11:15 that night, after 2 hours in the air, Flight 401 was ready to begin its descent. Air traffic control cleared the flight to an altitude of 9,700 feet, and the first officer started down. The weather in Miami was good. There were light winds from the east, good visibility, and scattered clouds at 2,500 feet. Given the easterly winds, the pilots would approach Miami from the west, out over the Florida Everglades, and then come in to land on runway 09 left. They had tuned the frequency for the runway's instrument landing system into their navigation radios, ensuring that they would be able to make an approach on instruments alone. However, given how clear a night it was likely that they would be able to see the runway from a long way out. As the cabin crew went down the aisles collecting rubbish, Captain Loft made an announcement to the passengers, welcoming them to Miami. The orange city stretched out along the coast in front of the pilots, visible through the L-1011's famously large cockpit windows. From a pilot's point of view, one of the nice things about flying to Florida is that it's so low-lying. This means that terrain is basically not a concern. By all appearances, this would be a completely routine approach and landing. Shortly after 20 minutes past 11 that night, Flight 401 reached its cleared altitude of 9,700 feet. The controller then gave further instructions to set them up for an approach to runway 9 left. First Officer Stockstill began slowing the massive jet down, and Flight Engineer Repo went through the descent and approach checklist with the two pilots. As they slowed, they extended the flaps, notch by notch. By 11:30, the flight was just a few miles northwest of the airport. The approach controller instructed the pilots to turn left to intercept the localizer, the lateral component of the runway's instrument landing system. He then handed them off to Miami Tower, who would deal with the flight as it neared the runway. Following the guidance from the localizer beam, the first officer lined up with runway 09 left. He was now just 6 nautical miles from touchdown. Captain Loft made contact with the Miami Tower controller, but initially the controller didn't respond, because he was dealing with other flights. In the meantime, Loft instructed Stockstill to extend the landing gear. Normally, the decision about when to lower the gear would be Stockstill's as pilot flying. But it wasn't too out of the ordinary for a captain to make a call like this. However, in a few moments, this mixing of roles would show up again, in a far more consequential way. The landing gear came down, sending a rumble through the cabin. The captain tried calling the tower controller again, and this time he got a response. The controller told him to continue the approach to runway 9 left. The flight engineer went through the before landing checklist with the captain. Each item was satisfactory, until they got to the landing gear. Loft noticed that one of the landing gear indicator lights wasn't lit. He was looking for 3 green lights, one for the nose gear and one for each of the main gear, showing that they were both down and locked. But the one for the nose gear was just blank. Importantly, it wasn't red, which would mean that it was in transit. Rather, it simply wasn't lit at all. As with most things mechanical or electrical, this was likely nothing the simple turn it off and turn it back on again technique couldn't fix. Loft pulled the gear handle back up and waited for the gear to retract fully. The lights went red, as expected, and then extinguished. Once this happened, he dropped the handle again. As this was going on, Stockstill continued flying the approach. He had intercepted the glide slope by this point and was now descending towards the runway. Once the gear had extended, everything would be set for him to land. In the cabin, the passengers and crew could hear the loud grinding of the gear in transition, now for a second time. The captain watched as the lights went from red to green on the main landing gear, but just as before, for the nose gear, the red light simply extinguished, leaving no green light in its place. Now just barely 90 seconds from touchdown, the pilots had to quickly decide what to do. There wasn't enough time to cycle the gear again, so they had one question that needed answering. Was there a problem with the nose gear? Or was it just the light bulb that was faulty? If the light was the problem, the pilots could simply land and get the bulb replaced on the ground. But at this point, there was no way of knowing for sure. If they were to assume that the problem was with the light and not the nose gear itself, and they were wrong in this assumption, the consequences could be dire. Weighing this up, First Officer Stockstill suggested a go-round, and Captain Loft agreed. The captain radioed the tower controller, telling him that they didn't have a light on their nose gear and that they were going to circle to come back in and land. The controller told him to climb to 2,000 feet, fly straight ahead, and contact the approach controller again. Stockstill began pulling the nose of the plane up, and he asked for the gear to be raised, this being the normal procedure for a go-round. However, Loft said that they'd better keep the gear down for the moment, until they figured out what the problem was. There would be no point raising it and lowering it all night. After all, they needed it to be in the down position to be able to assess whether it was in fact working. As they climbed, now directly over the airport, the flight engineer suggested flicking a switch which illuminated every light in the cockpit. This should tell them whether the light itself was burnt out. He did this, and every light in the cockpit lit up. Every light except the green light for the nose gear. Just as the pilots had suspected, the nose gear indicator light had burned out. First Officer Stockstill asked Captain Loft to jiggle the light to see if it was just out of place. But that didn't do the trick either. At this point, the first officer had got the plane up to 2,000 feet. The captain switched over to the approach controller's frequency and made contact. The controller told them to turn left heading north and to maintain 2,000 feet. He was going to give them vectors to come back in and land. The first officer began turning the plane to the left, while the captain fiddled with the problem light. It was tough for Loft to reach, the light being closer to the co-pilot side of the cockpit. So he told Stockstill to engage the autopilot so that he could have a go at removing the light. the first officer engaged the altitude hold mode of the autopilot, so that it would maintain 2,000 feet. He also dialed in 360 degrees, or north, with the heading select knob. He then turned on the autopilot itself, in what's known as command mode, giving it full control over these two aspects of the plane's flight path. However, Stockstill elected to continue controlling the thrust of the engines manually. This would later prove important. Now with the autopilot flying the plane, Stockstill took his turn trying to pull the light out of its socket. The captain was giving him input, telling him he needed to twist it to the left first and then pull. A few moments into their troubleshooting, the controller issued another instruction, telling the pilots to turn further left onto a heading of 300 degrees, northwesterly. The first officer dialed this heading into the autopilot, and the plane began turning. This problem, in an aircraft as advanced as the L-1011, was a real nuisance. The pilots were almost certain that it was just the bulb that was faulty, and that there was nothing wrong with the nose gear itself. Nonetheless, it would be foolish and reckless for them to simply assume that this was the case. After all, there was the chance that somehow both the landing gear and the indicator light were faulty. If they couldn't determine that this wasn't the case before landing, they would have to prepare the cabin for an emergency landing. And so, the crew began searching for other indications as to the status of the gear. The captain asked flight engineer Repo if there was enough hydraulic pressure in the system that operates the landing gear, and Repo told him that the hydraulic pressure was fine across all systems. As it turned out, there was one very simple way the pilots could confirm the position of the gear. Beneath the cockpit, through a trapdoor and down a ladder, was a cramped room named the Hellhole, full of computers and electrical systems. There was also a small peephole, through which the nose landing gear mechanism was visible. Captain Loft turned around and asked Repo to go down the trapdoor into the avionics bay and check if the wheels were down. But just at that moment, as the captain turned around to face the flight engineer, something happened. His knee pressed against the control column. He didn't realize it. Nobody in the cockpit did. But in that moment, the force the captain applied to the control column was just enough to click the autopilot down a level, to a mode known as control wheel steering. In this mode, the pilots were, unknowingly as it turned out, now controlling the pitch of the plane through the control column. The aircraft's heading was still being controlled with the heading selector knob, but its altitude was now directly under the control of the pilots. Without making a sound, the light indicating alt blinked out, as the autopilot was no longer in altitude hold mode, where it would maintain the altitude dialed into this window here. In all large passenger aircraft, Boeing, Airbus, or indeed Lockheed, it is possible to disconnect the autopilot by applying enough force to the control column or side stick. This is a safety feature, in case the pilots need to take manual control in a hurry. A warning usually sounds if this happens, in case the pilots do it inadvertently. However, in this case, the aircraft provided no warning, because technically, its autopilot hadn't disengaged, but rather had just stepped down to a more basic mode. Still focused on the light, the first officer asked if the captain had a handkerchief, so he could get a better grip on it. Angelo Donadeo, the technician who had remained silent up to this point, offered some assistance to Stockstill, telling him to pull down and turn the light to the right, and then to the left. The first officer said it would be much easier if he had a pliers, but the flight engineer told him that if he used pliers, he'd probably break the light. As the men discussed how to get the light out, the approach controller gave them another instruction, telling them to turn further left onto a westerly heading. Captain Loft acknowledged this, and dialed this into the autopilot. Flight 401 continued its turn west, away from the bright lights of Miami, and out over the dark marsh of the Everglades. By this point, Loft was getting frustrated, and he again told the flight engineer to head down to the avionics bay to see if the nose gear was down. He jokingly added, "Screwing around with that damn 20-cent piece of light equipment. On this plane." The pilots laughed. Repo went down into the hellhole and peeked out through the small window into the blackened night. The pilots had no idea that the aircraft was no longer maintaining an altitude of 2,000 feet. Instead, it was slowly descending. Without any moon to illuminate the ground, or city lights to help them judge how high they were, the only way the pilots would be able to see that they were descending were by these instruments here, their altimeters. But right now, their focus was elsewhere in the cockpit. Realizing that this might take longer than he had first hoped, the captain radioed the controller and told him that they were going to go further west for a while to see if they could get the light to come on. He asked his colleagues in the cockpit how much fuel they had, to give him a sense of how long they would have left to troubleshoot the issue before they had to come in and land. 52.5 came the reply, as in 52,500 pounds, more than enough for them to resolve the issue. As it turned out, Flight 401 wasn't the only one dealing with landing gear problems on this night. A national airlines flight was also experiencing difficulties with its gear, requiring the airport fire trucks to be rolled out to meet it on landing. Controllers at Miami had their hands full getting this flight in, and so their attention was also elsewhere. In the cabin, the passengers could tell that there was probably some mechanical problem with the plane that warranted the pilots abandoning the approach and sorting it out. This would not have concerned many of them all that much, but what would have struck them as unusual was the lack of an announcement by the pilots as to what was going on, and how long they'd be circling for. Even stranger was the sight of a lighted antenna going past them out the windows, almost at their altitude. In the cockpit, the pilots still had their attention on a different light. They had finally gotten it out, but now came the issue of how to put it back in. They tried different variations of twisting and pushing, and as their frustration grew, their determination to get the light back in only got stronger. The fact that everyone was fixated on a single item should have sent alarm bells ringing in the pilots' heads. But there was a paradox here. Noticing that they were consumed by this in the first place would require them to stop being consumed by it. Before the era of crew resource management, simple airmanship would have told the pilots that this was a poor use of an entire crew's attention. How many pilots does it take to change a light bulb? Just one, actually. But that wasn't how the captain had delegated the crew's responsibilities on this night. But just then, as he tried shimmying the light in, First Officer Stockstill did notice something odd. His airspeed had crept up from 175 knots to almost 190. This was strange, but he didn't give it much thought. He assumed that he had probably left the engines on too high a power setting, so he pulled the throttle levers back slightly and resumed his attempts to get the light back in. But this anomaly pointed at the underlying problem that the pilots were missing. In fact, it was their first clue that something wasn't right. What the pilots didn't realize was that the plane's increase in speed had nothing to do with the engines. They were at the correct power setting for level flight. The problem was that the plane was not flying level. The bump that the captain had given the control column had pushed the nose down ever so slightly. And with that, the plane had started a shallow descent. As it descended, it picked up speed, the same way a car does when it goes downhill. If the plane had been in altitude hold mode, maintaining 2,000 feet, as the pilots thought, bringing the thrust levers back slightly would have helped the plane to slow down. That was what the first officer thought he was doing when he pulled the throttle levers back. But because the autopilot wasn't actively trying to keep the plane's altitude, this reduction in thrust meant that the plane's descent now got even steeper. What started off as a rate of descent of about 200 feet per minute soon began to tip towards 1,000 feet per minute. But because the pilots weren't looking at their instruments, they didn't notice this. Loft and Stockstill continued their efforts on the broken light bulb And just a few moments later, as they passed through an altitude of 1,750 feet, another clue came. The altitude chime sounded, indicating that they had deviated from their selected altitude by more than 250 feet. This was the first audible sign that something was amiss. However, this chime only sounded at the flight engineer position, and because the pilots were in the front of the cockpit and wearing their headsets, they didn't hear it. The flight engineer himself was down below in the avionics bay, and Donadeo, the technician in the cockpit, not being a pilot or flight engineer, couldn't be expected to understand the significance of the chime. So, the only audible warning that something was not right went unnoticed. Some L-1011s had a light that flashed to accompany the oral alert, but Eastern Airlines had disabled this on their L-1011s when the aircraft was less than 2,500 feet above the ground. Another chance to alert the pilots had been missed. The pilots could be forgiven for thinking that the plane was still being flown by the autopilot. They were new to the L-1011, and in previous aircraft they had flown, the autopilot was either on or off. It didn't have a grey zone called control wheel steering mode, where the pilots effectively steered the plane on autopilot through the control column. This limited understanding of the autopilot was widespread among pilots at the time, not least because Eastern Airlines forbade them from using the control wheel steering mode. As far as the crew of Flight 401 were concerned, the L-1011's autopilot was more complicated than those that preceded it, but it was pretty much an on or off system. Now, the crew were losing their patience. The first officer commented that if it weren't for this problem, they could have landed on time. After much trying, they finally gave up. They were sure that it was just the light that was faulty, and not the landing gear itself. The light test switch had shown that the bulb didn't work. The solution to all their problems would come when the flight engineer came up from the hellhole and confirmed that he could see the locking mechanism in place. And right at that moment, Repo popped his head up from the cockpit floor. But he had bad news. He couldn't see the nosewheel mechanism through the viewing window. It was too dark. Donadeo asked if the wheel well lights were on. They weren't. Captain Loft switched them on and told Repo to go have another look. The flight engineer went back down the ladder, and this time he was joined by Donadeo, leaving only Loft and Stockstill in the cockpit. The aircraft was now descending through 1,200 feet. Time was running out. By this point, the National Airlines flight with the gear problem had landed without incident. The approach controller was then free to direct his attention back to Eastern 401. But when he did, he noticed something odd. On his radar screen, the flight now appeared to be at an altitude of just 900 feet, instead of the 2,000 feet he had told it to maintain. This was 1972 though, and this type of radar was still in its infancy. It was far from unheard of for a controller to see transient inaccurate readings. The controller believed that this was one of those moments. In order to confirm whether 900 feet was indeed the plane's real altitude, he would have to wait until the radar swept past the plane a second or even third time to see if it gave the same reading. But in the meantime, just in case, the controller radioed the pilots, saying, "Eastern 401, how are things coming along out there?" Captain Loft, having sent the flight engineer down a second time, this time with the wheel well lights on, believed that he would soon get confirmation that the gear was down and locked. As such, he asked the controller if the flight could turn around and come back in to land. At this stage, he was now 20 nautical miles from the airport. The controller instructed the flight to turn left heading south, and the pilots complied, twisting the heading select knob to 180 degrees. Now descending through just 700 feet, the plane began its turn. Satisfied that the pilots seemed not to be having any other issues, the controller surmised that the altitude showing on his scope was just a glitch. With that, he went back to dealing with the other aircraft under his control. He didn't see the next radar sweep, which showed that Flight 401 was still very much in a descent. if he had asked the pilots specifically about their altitude, he would have discovered their mistake. But the vagueness of the phrase, "How are things coming along there?" meant that this clarification never happened. Now, in yet another cruel twist, physics was about to work against Flight 401. When a plane turns, the lifting force that the wings produce is no longer directed fully upwards. Some of it gets pointed sideways. This means that the total amount of force pointing upwards is reduced. But the weight of the plane is still fully pointed down. What this means is that during a turn, the force of gravity pulling a plane down is stronger than the force of lift in the upwards direction. If the pilots were flying manually, or if the autopilot was holding an altitude, they would have corrected for this by pulling back slightly on the control column. Of course, Loft and Stockstill didn't do this, because they thought that their autopilot was doing the flying, keeping them nicely at 2,000 feet. So, as Flight 401 began banking to the left, its initially shallow descent now started to steepen. The roughly 1,000 feet per minute it had been doing now began to increase towards 3,000 feet per minute. The clock was now ticking even faster. The pilots were oblivious to the fact that they were now on a collision course with the ground. One piece of equipment which could have alerted the pilots to this is called a ground proximity warning system. However, these were not mandatory in 1972, so as advanced as the L-1011 was, this plane didn't have one. So, unaided by anything but their basic instruments, the pilots had just seconds to see the gravity of their situation. And less than 20 seconds after starting the turn, First Officer Stockstill did see something. The alt annunciator light, which told them that the altitude hold function was engaged, was no longer illuminated. For the first time since the go-round at Miami, he looked at his altimeter. And to his shock, he saw that he was no longer at 2,000 feet, but just a few hundred feet, and descending rapidly. Stockstill couldn't believe what he was seeing. "We did something to the altitude," he said. "What? We're still at 2,000, right?" The pilots couldn't process what was happening. Their plane wasn't even remotely doing what they thought it was. "Hey, what's happening here?" shouted the captain. The radio altimeter, which detects the plane's height above the ground, beeped 6 times, as both pilots hauled back on their control columns. But it was too late. At 18 minutes to midnight, travelling at over 360 km per hour, Flight 401 smashed into the Florida Everglades to the west of Miami International Airport. 94 passengers died, along with both pilots. Incredibly, flight engineer Donald Repo and technician Angelo Donadeo survived, but Repo succumbed to his injuries in hospital in the days after the crash. In all, 75 people on board survived, although many sustained serious injuries. The crash of Flight 401 was the most deadly single air accident in US history at the time, and the first crash of a wide-body airliner. After analysing the flight data and cockpit voice recorders, it didn't take long for investigators to piece together why the plane had started descending from 2,000 feet. But the real mystery, and the thing that made this accident so terrifying, was the much bigger question of why the pilots didn't realise that they were descending. The answer to that question was the final missing jigsaw piece, and its ramifications are still felt on every commercial flight today. A series of changes swept through the aviation world in the wake of the accident, including the mandatory inclusion of a ground proximity warning system on all passenger jets, a more clear audio-visual alert when an aircraft has deviated from its selected altitude, and bulletins from airlines to their L-1011 pilots, warning them about the dangers of accidentally bumping the control column. In addition to this, it has since become mandatory for air traffic controllers to inform pilots of any significant altitude deviation clearly. But the biggest change to the world of aviation since this crash wasn't technical at all, but interpersonal. As it turned out, there was nothing wrong with the aircraft all along, apart from the blown bulb. But the captain, as commander of the flight, allowed his entire crew's attention to be directed towards this bulb for 4 straight minutes. During this period, not a single person in the cockpit was carrying out what is always the most important function: flying the plane. As a result, the crash of Eastern Flight 401 paved the way for the introduction of a concept known as cockpit resource management, the predecessor of what today is called crew resource management, as it extends to the cabin crew as well. A key component of crew resource management is the clear separation of duties in the cockpit and the delegating of tasks among crew members during both normal and abnormal situations. How this would have looked on board Flight 401 is that one of the pilots would have ignored the issue with the bulb and simply flown the aircraft, while the other tried to fix it. The introduction of CRM into cockpits the world over throughout the 1980s and 1990s has coincided with a substantial reduction in air crashes. Pilots are now more aware of their role in the overall system and of the uniquely human threats that can arise on a flight. No story about the crash of Eastern 401 is complete without a mention of the alleged ghost sightings by Eastern Airlines crew members of the captain and flight engineer on board other Eastern Airlines aircraft after the accident. However, the real legacy of this flight is the thousands of lives that have been saved by crew resource management since its introduction in the years following the accident.